Yeah.
Great. Welcome to the 2025 Richard M. Dorson Lecture. Is that too loud? Am I holding it too close?
Perfect.
Thank you. You know this. I'm Pravina Shukla. I'm the chair of the Department of Folklore and Ethnomusicology. Very proud to be the chair of this department. I'd like to begin by inviting you all to a reception back in the department across the street, 800 East 3rd Street, right after the lecture, right after the Q&A. So please come to the lecture, to the reception. There is food and drinks and a chance to interact with each other. This lecture is named after Richard Dorson. Dorson was the most important folklorist of his era, diverse in his skills and his powers. A good administrator, he consolidated and expanded the Department of Folklore at Indiana University. Though he was primarily interested in oral literature, he expanded the department to include both ethnomusicology and material culture. Though he was himself an Americanist, he built an international department. A successful teacher, he directed the dissertation of many of the leaders of the next generation. As a scholar, he used his fieldwork to create an early and important book, Bloodstoppers and Bearwalkers, and 2 collections of African American folktales. As a scholar, he also used a historical understanding to write 2 popular books on American folklore. As a skilled editor, his great monument was the Folktales of the World series, which built a consistent anthology of the folktales of many countries of the world. As an editor, he created the book Folklore and Folklife, a master survey of the state of folklore at the time. Members of the Dorson family could not make it today. We did invite them. I heard from his sons Roland and Jeff. They sent their regards and regrets. His grandson Ben wrote to me this: Dr. Ó Giolláin's lecture sounds very interesting, and I'm sure my grandfather will be watching from somewhere. People in the room and people above in heaven watching the lecture with him. His grandson continued, congratulations to all the new PhDs. I'm so happy to hear that the folklore department and its graduates are thriving. That was because I told the Dorson family that we have 22 PhDs this year in our department, which is fantastic. We have to clap. Yes.
Not to be a bummer, but we have 22 defenses. We'll see.
You know, the glass is half empty or half full. The Dorson Lecture allows the department to invite a prominent scholar to deliver a public lecture and to engage with students and faculty. For the last 2 years, one of our PhD students, Emily Bianchi, has organized a Dorson Lecture reading group, giving us an opportunity to read and discuss the publications of our invited speakers. So thank you, Emily, for doing that. The Dorson Lecture events are made possible by the donations of friends and former students who have contributed generously. Founding donors Bill Ivey, Sandra Doby, Mike Jones, and some who have chosen to remain anonymous. Many others have also contributed to the fund. I'd like to acknowledge all of those who are donors to the fund. If you have donated to the fund, will you please stand up so we can thank you? If you'd like to donate to the fund, let us know. Always taking contributions. Previous Dorson lecturers, this is about the prominence of this wonderful lecture that the funds help us accomplish. Previous lecturers include Roger Abrams, Margaret Mills, Carl Lindahl, Charles Briggs, Patricia Turner, Regina Bendix, Dan Benamos, Dorothy Noyes, Tom Mould, who's in the room right now, Barbara Kirschenbach-Gimlet, Terry Gunnell, and Ulo Volk. I would like to welcome Professor Ó Giolláin back home to the Hoosier State. I now turn to my colleague Ray Cashman, glass is half empty, to introduce this year's distinguished Dorson lecturer. Thank you.
Thank you, Pravina. It is my honor to introduce our speaker today, Professor Diarmuid Ó Giolláin. Now, in a different world, in a different context, I might be introducing Diarmuid Ó Giolláin. But events in the late 19th century and early 20th century were rather interesting, he said elliptically. We'll come back to that. I do want to say that for those of you who have taken my Irish folklore class, you're already familiar with his work. That is to say, we've read a number of his earlier articles, classics such as Perspectives in the Study of Folk Religion, Fairy Belief and Official Religion in Ireland, and Revisiting the Holy Well. And those of you who have taken my seminar on the concept of tradition, you've had a chance to read his Locating Irish Folklore, Tradition, Modernity, and Identity. Now, I mention all of this just to put you back in mind the fact that many of you are familiar with his work. But for those of you who aren't, I'm telegraphing that, of course, as all of our interests do, his have evolved over time. So Diarmuid's focus over time has shifted from, let's say, vernacular religion and language, popular culture, and national identity to cultural history. And in a more recent phase, I would say, the history of ideas and institutions in folklore studies, or more generally, an interest in the discursive and political implications of concepts such as tradition, modernity, community, place, and not just in Ireland, but on a global scale. We'll come back to that. But just a little more career sketching first. Most recently, Diarmuid served as concurrent professor of anthropology and of Irish language and literature at the University of Notre Dame. There he was also a fellow of the Keogh Naughton Institute for Irish Studies. But before Notre Dame, he served in the Department of Folklore and Ethnology at University College Cork, Ireland, one of my alma maters. There he was instrumental in shaping the curriculum that I benefited from, and he mentored a generation of scholars. Now, throughout his career, Diarmuid has held several prestigious fellowships and visiting professorships in places such as Finland, Sweden, France, and Argentina. Notably, in the spring of 2015, he was a visiting professor in the folklore program at the University of California, Berkeley. Now, among Diarmuid's monographs, we have already mentioned Locating Irish Folklore, Tradition, Modernity, Identity. This won the Catherine Briggs Folklore Prize in 2000. I would say that in this book, Diarmuid starts with Ireland, but he extends his comparanda to several European countries, and notably to Latin America, in order to situate the concept of folklore historically and politically, noting its uses and perhaps gesturing towards some of its abuses in identity formation and nation building. Now, he followed this with Dúchas, agus Domhan. Now, this translates roughly vernacular tradition and the world. Dúchas is one of those words that has a lot of different layers, but for our purposes, this book also deals with the historic emergence and subsequent nature of folklore studies, but it seeks to more explicitly redirect folklore studies from its defining origins while making a case for a Gramscian interpretation of folklore as subaltern discourse and non-elite cultural processes. Now today, I don't know what happened to that screen, we'll get it back here in a second. This presentation is drawn from his research for Exotic Dreams in the Science of the Volksgeist toward a global history of European folklore studies, which was honored with the Chicago Folklore Prize in 2023. Now, by the way, if you go to A Books or to Amazon, don't just put in Exotic Dreams. I was tempted to read the blurbs from those books, but let me just give you some advice. Go ahead and put in Volksgeist. Narrow it down for you. Now, what's going on in this book? Diarmuid acknowledges but looks beyond the usual association of folklore studies with nationalism by discussing the shaping influences of imperialism and colonialism. In particular, growing awareness of and imaginings of an exotic, non-European New World filtered into the European intellectual currents that gave rise to folklore studies. So folklore studies, a seemingly inward-looking domestic ethnology, becomes quite a bit more complicated, less exclusively European, and altogether global in its imaginative and conceptual framework, where notions of the domestic or vernacular and the exotic became fundamentally intertwined. But you don't have to take my word for it. If you don't believe the words I say, enter in Dermot, he'll so clear the way. In other words, let us all put our hands together and give a warm welcome to Professor Dermot Ó Giolláin. We're turning him on right now.
Thank you very much. First, to my shame, I must remove this piece of visual clutter, which is my bag. Praveen and Ray, thank you so much for your kind words. I'm very honoured to be here to give the Dorson lecture. When I was a student, of course, we read Dorson from cover to cover, the folklife introduction, and to me it still is one of the key works that sort of helps to define a discipline. But this trip here too, I'm so grateful for all the hospitality, for the work that Michelle put in, for Barbara, for John, for Dave, Eduardo, who brought me to lunch or to dinner, for the wonderful graduate students I had the pleasure of meeting yesterday and today. So it really is an honour. I'm very honoured to be here, and I'm delighted to be here as well. Down the road from where I spent the last 14 years, but it really is a pleasure to be here and an honour. Thank you very much. In Folklore and Folklife, an introduction, Richard Dorson divided the Americas from the Old World on the basis of the historical fact of colonisation. Hence, what he called the relative stability, rootedness, and long ancestry, as he put it, of Europe, as opposed to the New World blends in which several collateral traditions, rather than one homogenized folklore, coexist. In American Folklore from 1959, Dorson defined folklore in the US as the culture of the people, the hidden, submerged culture lying in the shadow of the official civilization about which historians write. Here he was using the word people in the sense of the lower social classes, those whom in England William Thomas had in mind when he coined the word folklore in 1846. Social distinctions, however, were ambiguous in European folkloristics, as the field prospered along with the study of language and literature as national sciences, and oscillated between the different senses of the word people. People as social group, or people as ethno-linguistic community. Folkloristics, as professionalized and institutionalized in Europe, looked inwards. It was informed by the idea of cultural authenticity, the Volksgeist, and associated with cultural nationalism. Anthropology, on the other hand, looked outwards and was allied with colonialism. This is more or less the received wisdom regarding the origins of folkloristics and anthropology. It is not coincidental the first chairs of folkloristics were established in two countries where national movements were flourishing and that would give rise, respectively, to an independent Kingdom of Norway in 1905 and a Republic of Finland in 1970. University departments and archives of folklore eventually grew up in most countries in Central and Eastern Europe, in the newly united Germany, in the successor states of the Habsburg, Russian and Ottoman empires, and in the small Scandinavian kingdoms. Herder, the Grimm brothers, philology and cultural nationalism are usually seen as the direct or indirect inspiration for folklore studies in those countries. Western European countries such as Britain, France, Spain and Portugal trace their political origins back many centuries. Folkloristics, while finding a place in intellectual life in those countries, was not professionalized or institutionalized. No new states appeared in this region other than Ireland. Dorson's relative stability, rootedness and long ancestry, as he put it, was certainly true of Western European states, but not of Central or Eastern European ones. It was true of European folklore to a significant extent. even if many of the same forces that shaped the inhabitants of the Americas also influenced Europeans. Colonization, after all, was a two-way process, and the feedback from the encounter with exotic populations and the process of imperial expansion helped to shape European ideals. In 1580, Montaigne wrote in his famous essay, De Cannibal, he meant the Brazilian Tupinambá. He wrote that, "I think there is nothing barbarous and savage in that nation, from what I have been told, except that each man calls barbarian whatever is not his own practice." A cultural relativist position on European society was developed by writers who used the ideal of the primitive to critique their own societies, their writings informed by the numerous travel accounts and other proto-ethnographic writings already in circulation. As Andrew Curran puts it, textualized Africans, Indians, Laplanders, Asians, and Patagonians wove themselves into the fabric of 18th century thought. End of quote. The supposed innocence, the happiness, and the wisdom of the noble savage seemed to imply that such instruments of civilization as the use of writing were not necessary for a society to uphold strong moral values or to maintain its legal traditions. The term the noble savage, incidentally in English, first appeared in 1672 in John Dryden's The Conquest of Granada. One consequence of this was the valorization of oral tradition, which was to become the defining characteristic of the research field that crystallized in the course of the 19th century as folklore studies. The concept of oral tradition originally came from the field of theology. According to the Catholic understanding that developed in the 15th century and later became a dogma of the Counter-Reformation, truth resided both in Scripture and in the unwritten tradition of the Church, while Protestants tended to dismiss the worth of oral tradition, stressing Scripture alone. Jurists had outlined the principles of an unwritten natural law underlying statutory law, and since the mid-17th century, the authority of the unwritten traditions of English customs and law had been invoked as the ancient constitution. There was a certain logic in the expansion of the notion of oral tradition from the theological into the ethnological domain. The Jesuit missionaries of New France were educated in the classics and well versed in the study of mythology, and they often read indigenous American cultures through analogies with the ancient world. In his comparative work, Mœurs des sauvages américains comparées aux mœurs des premiers temps, Lafitau drew on his 5-year sojourn among the Iroquois to contend that knowledge of writing was not necessary to their maintenance of a sophisticated culture and social system. Indeed, he referred to, quote, the oral tradition which they conserve of their country's history. Since history began with the Garden of Eden and humanity's dispersal after the deluge, American savages were no more outside of history than were the French, and they must have originated in the Old World. As a priest, Lafitau shared the common theological view of a primitive revelation, corrupted over time, which, in spite of the dispersal of humanity throughout the world, left traces even among the least civilized peoples. If the indigenous Americans could thus be considered to be among the last guardians of the natural religion given directly by God to humanity, Lafitau could also compare their myths to Homer and to classical mythology, and their oratory and political assemblies to those of Greece. Writing at the same time, Vico, in his Scienza Nuova, contended that myths were historical sources, avenues into the mindset of an earlier stage of human development, and ancient poetry opened up the spirit of a barbarous world. Barbarous peoples, he wrote, cut off from all the other nations of the world, as were the Germans and the American Indians, have been found to preserve in verses the beginnings of their history. Comparisons of indigenous American peoples to the Greeks and Romans were evidence of the development of a subtler understanding of the European classical age itself, and more positive fictional as much as documentary representations of oral cultures demonstrated a new perspective according to which non-literate societies embodied what had been allegedly lost in Europe: innocence, passion, and naturalness, which is how Rousseau was to argue. The fact that scholars began to credit the power of the language of Homer, the father of European poetry, to the original primitive vigour of his society was significant. An inquiry into the life and writings of Homer by Thomas Blackwell, a significant figure of the Scottish Enlightenment, was widely admired. One of Blackwell's arguments was that it was unlikely that a country could be both, quote, thoroughly civilised and afford proper subjects for poetry, since peace, harmony and good order, which make the happiness of a people, are the bane of a poem that subsists by wonder and surprise, end of quote. Challenging the refined urban milieu usually associated with the ancient Greeks, Blackwell stressed the primitive world in which Homer moved. From the 1760s on, there was a dramatic increase in the number of British and especially of Scottish texts making the case for sophisticated oral societies. Robert Wood was Anglo-Irish. His essay on the original genius and writings of Homer, with a comparative view of the ancient and present state of the Troad, was informed by his extensive travels. His interpretation of Homer was based on his observations of living cultures, especially of the Arabs, and his case was that Homer, in effect, belonged to an oral tradition. The Scottish moral philosophers, people like Adam Smith, David Hume, Alan Ferguson, and so forth, seeking to explain the transition of humanity from the state of nature to contemporary civilization, used a stadial theory of social organizations that saw progress in stages from hunter-gathering to commerce. These men were aware of the contemporary social and economic transformation of Scotland, but they were struck by the difference between the modern commercial cities of the lowlands in which they lived and the distinct society of the Gaelic Highlands, where apparently earlier forms of social organisation subsisted, traditionally dismissed as barbarity by the lowlanders. The scepticism of some of these philosophers towards progress and indeed towards savagery was influenced by the Scottish context and was strongest in the work of Adam Ferguson, a Gaelic-speaking Highlander who, along with Hugh Blair, was one of the key defenders of Ossian. Pardon me, I must have a drink of water. I'm used to, in Europe now, you know, they're all connected. So they can be recycled together, I presume. Ossian was the literary sensation of the day. James Macpherson, Ossian's translator, who was, of course, in fact, its author, was well informed of contemporary intellectual debate and was aware both of classical epic and of modern epics such as John Milton's Paradise Lost from 1667. The idea of the Scottish Gael, of the Scottish Highlander, as a sort of noble savage, was especially prominent in the Romantic era, but had also appeared earlier in Scotland. The fear of decadence weakening empire, as recounted by Gibbon in the history of the decline and fall of the Roman Empire in 1776, gave added value to the primitive virtues of peoples such as the Highlanders, once they had been fully integrated into civilized life. And of course, by the time of the appearance of Ossian, any threat from the Highlanders had been conclusively repressed. The Battle of Culloden, of course. The imperial idea of martial races, ideal providers of soldiers, is closely associated with this. The noble savage was an ideal, but the cultures with which the savage was associated were fated to extinction. In a study of the origins of ethnology, the late French scholar Daniel Fabre points to the influence of the discovery of expiring exotic cultures. From Macpherson's Ossian and Walter Scott's The Lay of the Last Minstrel, to Chateaubriand's Les Natchez, and Fenimore Cooper's The Last of the Mohicans. In La Poésie des Races Celtiques, the poetry of the Celtic races, Ernest Renan wrote that the Celtic people had, these are his words, had worn itself out in resistance to its time and in the defense of desperate causes. It was not susceptible to progress and was doomed to disappear. Ossian, despite its great influence, did not promote the Gaelic language. It appeared in English rather than in the Gaelic vernacular, and the debate about its authenticity was carried out to a large extent by individuals ignorant of the original language. Its influence on culture and nationalism was largely by Germany, where it had a great impact on Herder. His 1773 essay on Ossian and the songs of older peoples made keen observations on poetic creation, and I quote, "You must realise that the wilder a people is, which is to say, the more life and freedom a people possesses, the more sensual and lyrical they are in their actions," he wrote. And he continued, "The more removed that people is from artificial, rational ways of thinking, speaking and writing, the less they lend themselves to being represented on paper, where they would simply become the dead letters of poetic verse," end of quote. And of course he made interesting comparisons. In every case of the bardic songs, and by the bardic songs he means Ossian, in every case of the bardic songs they resemble those of another people who are still singing and going about their lives today. Without predilection or prejudice, I can sense in their narratives the history of Ossian and his ancestors, which has more than once been given life. Here I refer to the 5 nations of North America, songs of death and songs of war, songs of battle and songs for the grave, historical songs about the ancestors and addressed to the ancestors. I find all these common to Ossian's bard and to the indigenous peoples of North America. He finished his essay by admonishing Germans, "Do not imitate anything, or you will always lag behind." Ossian Macpherson's Northern Homer demonstrated the model of a great literature that was independent of the classical heritage, and as such was a huge inspiration to his hopes of seeing an authentic German literature and art flourishing in opposition to the foreign models that had dominated Germany since the Renaissance. Herder had great influence on folklore studies, especially through the Grimm brothers. Among his key ideas were the belief in the value of belonging to a group or to a culture, the idea that artistic creativity expresses the entire personality of the individual or the group and is intelligible only in its terms, and the belief in the incommensurability of different cultures and societies. The promotion of a German literature and art that would not be an imitation of foreign models was consistent with those ideas. Every culture, he thought, had to be admired for what it was and according to its own terms of reference. Hence his intense curiosity about other peoples. His Volkslieder, for example, included poetry from all over the world. References to travel writing and to non-European peoples appeared frequently in other works of his. In the preface to Ideas for a Philosophy of the History of Mankind from the 1780s to 1791, he admitted to having read almost everything he could on the subject, though he complained of the limits to much contemporary Western knowledge, with whole peoples and regions practically unknown to Western observers. And 2 books from Ideas for a Philosophy of the History of Mankind were devoted to ethnology, with descriptions of the different circumpolar peoples and of various Asian, African, Oceanian and American populations. Sorry, I have a touch of a wheeze since the flight, but you don't have to go to the tornado room to escape me. I don't think there's anything contagious. Concern for the status of the German language vis-à-vis Latin and French long predated Herder. In 2 essays from the late 17th century, the polymath scholar Leibniz called for the development of the German language as a fully equipped literary and scientific medium. For Leibniz, languages were the most ancient of historical sources, and they helped to trace the origins of peoples. He corresponded with Peter the Great of Russia and played a key role in the foundation of the Russian Academy of Sciences in 1725 and in the determination of its scientific remit. His approach of describing peoples and identifying relationships between them in order to establish their origins underlay ethnology as it developed in the 18th and 19th centuries in Germany as well as in Russia. Han Vermeulen, this is a wonderful book I think, has shown how ethnography originated as a collaboration of Russian scientists and enlightened administrators with German-speaking historians and naturalists. German-speaking scholars dominated the Russian Academy of Sciences from the beginning and took a key role in the many scientific expeditions dispatched from 1714 to territories newly acquired by the Russian Empire. The second Kamchatka expedition, the 1730s to 1740s, led by the Dane Vitus Bering, was initially meant to explore the sea routes between Siberia and North America, but a scientific mission, of which the historian Gerhard Friedrich Müller was a member, was added to it in order to describe the natural resources and the peoples of Siberia. Müller was a historian who had come to Russia in 1725, and he was influenced by Lafitaux's work in North America. Systematically and comprehensively beginning the scientific description of the peoples of Siberia, he initially called this new field of research Historia Gentium, a history of peoples. But by 1740, he was calling it Völkerbeschreibung, the description of peoples. The Russian Empire was distinct from the Western European empires in that it expanded over land. Seaborne empires brought radically different cultures in contact with one another, while the land-based ones led to more gradual encounters on a continuum of cultural difference. Russians spread across the Eurasian steppes, following routes previously taken westwards by various nomadic peoples, the Huns, the Pechenegs, the Mongols, the Proto-Hungarians, etc. Moving eastwards, they encountered peoples who had ethno-linguistic kindred in European Russia, who were Muslims, Buddhists, or practitioners of indigenous religions, who spoke Turkic, Mongolic, or Uralic languages, and were nomadic herders, hunter-gatherers, agriculturalists, or city dwellers. I mean, this is some of these language groups. A shock of the kind that Western Europeans experienced on encountering indigenous Americans was not experienced by the Russians, who encountered more of a gradual shading of physical types, languages, and cultures as they moved eastwards. As Sergei Glebov puts it, quote, "The first native Siberians would have appeared to the Russians as little different from the various Turkic and Finno-Ugric peoples of the Volga-Kama basin," end of quote, which is in European Russia. Of the three stages in the development of ethnography and ethnology identified by Vermeulen, Müller was at the origin of the first. A second stage was the conceptualization of ethnology in the German-speaking countries. August Ludwig Schlözer, an assistant to Müller, who had worked with him in St. Petersburg, probably brought his ideas with him back to Germany. As you can see, neither of them would win a beauty contest. Schlözer was associated with the emergence of the new terms Ethnographia in 1767 and Völkerkunde, and Ethnographie from 1771. For him, the importance of ethnography was in investigating the origins of nations in northern Eurasia and in helping to organize them into a system of peoples. Following this, the word ethnologia was coined in Vienna in the 1780s to refer to the study of the past and present condition of peoples, taking their origins, languages, customs, and institutions into account. Volkskunde, knowledge about a people, if you like, was recorded in 1776 for the first time in the Netherlands, and in a work of natural history, and in Göttingen in 1782. The difference between the two terms, the difference between the two terms was between the historical and descriptive study of one or one's own people and the comparative study of many or of all peoples. Völkerkunde described and compared different peoples as ethno-linguistic entities. Volkskunde, especially under the influence of Romanticism, came to look at the people more as a socio-linguistic entity. The complex ethnic geography of Central and Eastern Europe, where numerous ethnic, linguistic, and religious groups lived side by side in a relatively restricted territory, and not all in a hierarchical relationship with each other, gave linguistic features an obvious salience in identifying distinct population groups. This applied especially to the multi-ethnic Habsburg, Russian, and Ottoman empires, in each of which more than one language was of administrative, social, and political importance. Indeed, in the European territories of these three empires are now to be found between 20 and 30 different nation-states with as many national languages. If Leibniz saw language as a key tool in tracing the origins of people, the origins of peoples, the development of comparative philology in the 19th century provided a much deeper history for national origins. Unlike the peoples of the Mediterranean, the origins of Northern European peoples were seemingly lost in a dim and illegible past, until comparative philology helped to give them a deeper and more ancient history that put them on par with the interpretation of the classical world. From the 16th and 17th centuries, relationships between the Uralic languages were proposed by scholars. In 1770, the Hungarian Jesuit János Sajnovics proved the relationship between the languages of two very different peoples. The Hungarians, organised in a powerful aristocratic society in Central Europe, and the Sami, a marginalised indigenous population at the northern extremity of Europe. This work in turn informed the relationship of Hungarian with Finnish, demonstrated by the Transylvanian-born scholar Diarmuid Ó Giolláin in 1799. Western Europeans had direct contact with India at least from 1498, when Vasco da Gama set foot there, and similarities between Sanskrit and Italian were already noted in the 16th century. The French Jesuit Gaston Laurent Courdoux in 1767 demonstrated the relationship of Sanskrit to Greek and Latin, though his observations were not published until much later. And in 1786, the British philologist and judge Sir William Jones brought the relationship to a wider scholarly public. The Finnish scholar Matthias Alexander Castrén used his pioneering research into Uralic languages in the same way as the German philologists did with Indo-European. As Yoko Hautala puts it, he wanted to find and believed he had found at least as great a kindred and as glorious traditions for the small, remote Finnish nation as any scholars of Indo-European languages had done in their own sphere. And again, you can see that in the map of Uralic languages, the development of Indo-European philology gave, the Finns here, gave them membership in a much wider world. In 1851, Castrén was appointed first professor of Finnish language and literature at the University of Helsinki, which had a different name at the time. And his duties included teaching the language, literature, and ethnology of the Finns and of these other related speakers of Finno-Ugric or Uralic languages. In time, Indo-European studies expanded beyond the domain of language. If Indo-European languages spread widely in Eurasia through migration, could other elements have done so as well? Loiselot de Longchamp was the first to suggest an Indian origin for folk tales in his Essai sur les fables and the Essay on Indian Fables from 1838. Wilhelm Grimm proposed that folk tales were found in regions in which Indo-European languages were spoken and were inherited from a common Indo-European antiquity. Theodore Benfai elaborated on this in several works, and above all in the introduction to his edition of the ancient collection of Sanskrit fables, the Panchatantra from 1859. And Benfai argued that most animal tales were of Western origin, derived from Aesop's fables, but folk tales, and especially the Märchen, or tales of magic, had spread from India. What I've been discussing so far is how European debates about poetry and oral tradition were influenced by American encounters, how the origins of an ethno-linguistically informed ethnology and folklore can be traced to descriptions of Eurasian peoples, and how the development of comparative and especially Indo-European philology challenged the notion of a European culture bounded by natural geographic frontiers and resting only on a classical and a biblical inheritance. These ideas, sorry, no, I'm not sure, do I have a, oh sorry, there's Castrén, sorry, I'll come to that in a moment. So these ideas help to shape folkloristics in countries defined by cultural nationalism, and in which the colonial world was not an obvious reference. But what I would next like to discuss is how the colonial world impacted on these countries, despite there not being colonial powers as such. Non-Western ethnographic artifacts are to be found in every European country, and were acquired by traders, missionaries, colonial officials, soldiers, and sailors. For example, significant such ethnographic collections can be found in both Norway and Ireland. Congo has an especially strong presence in Scandinavian ethnographic collections because Norwegians and other Scandinavians were especially prominent in the exploration and commercial exploitation of the Congo Free State. Ethnographic collections consisting of artifacts from the native cultures of the Americas, of Africa, Asia and Oceania were brought to Ireland in the same way as to other European countries by traders, missionaries, colonial officials, soldiers and sailors. The majority of the collectors were Anglo-Irish, and the institutions that acquired the collections were dominated by the Anglo-Irish elite and were linked through them to global imperial networks, which is one of the reasons why these collections were neglected after Irish independence. Anyone visiting museum collections in Ireland doesn't realise that there's extraordinary non-European Western ethnographic collections effectively in hiding. At a time of mass emigration, Europeans settled wherever they could, either in colonies of their own or of other countries or in the new settler republics of the Americas. Positive and affirming stories of emigration were told in every European country, and the success of immigrants was often a source of pride. But immigrants also had contact with indigenous peoples and shared representations of them with family and friends in their home countries. And to give some lesser known examples, Estonian settlements were established in Siberia from the 1850s. Welsh-speaking settlers established themselves in Patagonia from 1865. There was a settlement of 130 Irish in Algeria in 1869, which was a failure. A Norwegian settlement was established in South Africa in the 1890s. These are just haphazard examples. From the early 19th century, exotic individuals or groups were exhibited or performed widely in Europe, of which the following are the best known examples. American minstrel shows with white performers in blackface or with African Americans were put on from the early 19th century. George Catlin's Indian Gallery with Native American performers toured Britain, Ireland, France and Belgium in the 1840s. Buffalo Bill's Wild West show between 1887 and 1906 toured Britain, France, Italy, Germany, Belgium and performed in venues in the Austro-Hungarian Empire that are now in Austria, Hungary, Czechia, Slovenia, Croatia, Serbia, Romania, Poland and Ukraine. Between the 1850s and the 1940s, the so-called human zoos were staged in very many European countries, associated with circuses, theatres and cabarets, and with national, international, colonial or universal expositions, including in France, the Netherlands, Belgium, Britain, Ireland, Italy, Switzerland, Austria, Hungary, Poland, Spain, Portugal, Norway, Sweden and Denmark. Norway, for example, hosted a Jubilee exhibition in 1914, at which one of the central exhibits was the Congo village, which attracted large numbers of visitors. Among the attractions of the 1932 Irish Industrial and Agricultural Fair in Cork was a Senegalese village. This was actually from Dublin, the Irish International Exhibition in 1907, and you can see from the German inscription, this was one of these travelling ethnographic shows that Hagenbeck seems to be the originator of this genre. In the interwar period in much of Europe, black people were associated with entertainment, especially jazz, and were also represented in advertisements for exotic products such as coffee and cocoa. Finally, I would like to look at a few European folklorists who had colonial careers or experience. There are complications in discussing this, since it took time for disciplines to be consolidated and for scholars to fully identify or be identified with one discipline or the other. For example, in France in the late 19th and early 20th century, according to Emeritus, the ethno-anthropological field was split into 3 different domains with few connections between them, and she identified them as what she called moribund philosophical ethnography, an anthropology that was effectively physical anthropology and that was compromised by its focus on race, and what she called developing folkloristic and ethnographic practices that lacked institutional or academic homes in which they might be made more systematic, as she put it. So that's sort of the context when things are still only crystallizing. Arnold van Gennep early publications were devoted to the non-European world and were not based on fieldwork, with volumes on taboo and totemism in Madagascar, on myth in Australia, and on passage ritual, for which he provided, of course, the classical formulation in the Rites of Passage. In 1908, he co-founded the Revue des Études Ethnographiques et Sociologiques, the Journal of Ethnographic and Sociological Studies, and in 1910 he co-founded the International Ethnographic Institute. Other than a period from 1912 to 1915, when he was professor of ethnography at the Swiss University of Neuchâtel, his career was spent as an independent scholar. The 5 months in 1911 and 1912 he spent doing fieldwork in Algeria led to En Algérie, an idiosyncratic ethnographic account that was nevertheless not unsympathetic to colonial policy. From the 1920s, he devoted himself to the ethnography of France, insisting on the value of fieldwork. He considered ethnography to be the same, whether conducted at home or in the colonies. He was one of the key members of the Société de Folklore Français, which in 1932 became the Société de Folklore Français et Colonial. His monumental Manuel de Folklore Français Contemporain, the Manual of Contemporary French Folklore, begun in 1937, remained unfinished at his death in 1957. Another French figure was René Monnier, trained in law, ethnology, economics, and political science. He taught in law faculties in France, Egypt, and Algeria, in the last of which he also taught sociology. He was president of the Société de Folklore Français et de Folklore Colonial in the 1930s, and of the Institut International de Sociologie in the 1940s, so he moved between disciplines. A key proponent of juridical ethnology, he published 2 significant works on the subject, Loi française et coutumes indigènes en Algérie, French law and indigenous custom in Algeria in 1932, in which he showed strong support for colonialism, and Introduction au folklore juridique, an introduction to juridical folklore from 1938, a book, incidentally, which deserves to be better known. He compared popular customs in France to native customs in the colonies, and as he put it, since the state was the only maker of laws, the rest does not merit the honour of being named. End of quote. In Britain and France, long-established nation-states, folklore studies always remained peripheral, and as the careers of Van Gennep and Monnier suggest, briefly found the limelight at a time when the ethnological disciplines had not yet been conclusively professionalized. Italy was somewhat different. During the Risorgimento, the long political and cultural struggle to unite the country, there was sustained interest in folklore as an expression of the Volksgeist at a time when Italy did not have a political identity. If there were initial domestic concerns at colonial expansion as a betrayal of the spirit of the Risorgimento, imperialism eventually became a powerful force in Italy. Interest in folklore nevertheless continued, though now in the context of the need to understand the obstacles to social and cultural reunification, particularly the southern question in Italy. And it was in this context particularly that the field of juridical folklore blossomed. Lamberto Loria was a noted Italian explorer. His expeditions to Lapland, Turkestan, New Guinea and Eritrea contributing significantly to Italian museum collections in ethnography, as well as botany and zoology. He was 50 years old when he came to the ethnography of Italy in 1905, and he resolved to dedicate the rest of his life to it, founding the National Museum of Italian Ethnography in 1906, the Society of Italian Ethnography in 1910, and the journal Laris, which intermittently is still going. He wrote in 1912 that it was not possible to study Italian, these are his words, it is not possible to study Italian ethnography without knowing that of other peoples, whether they be civilized, semi-civilized, or savage. End of quote. He wrote again, just as a savage has analogies with primitive man, so too our less evolved classes, left behind on the path to civilization, still maintain hidden and somnolent some of the instincts and character of savage people. Here he's talking about the south of Italy. He published his final article in the first number of Laris, an article entitled Ethnography as an Instrument of Domestic and Colonial Policy, which appeared in 1912. And in that article he argued that if understanding, as he put it, the usages and customs of peoples subject to a civilized nation facilitates the latter's maintenance in its rule, even more so would it be of benefit to the Italian nation to understand its own people. A second Italian, Raffaele Corso, worked on juridical proverbs, which subject was his major research interest to the last years of his life. He was the first Italian folklorist to deal with the question systematically, outlining what he saw, at least for a time, as a new historical and sociological science of juridical archaeology that was inspired by Tyler's concept of survival. He founded the journal Il Folklore Italiano in 1925. For the folklorists, according to Corso, the vulgus, they used the Latin term, had the same importance as had savage, natural or primitive man for the ethnographer. Besides his voluminous work on his native Calabria, he was an active colonial ethnographer. He wrote on Ethiopian juridical proverbs in a 1920 article, and he used the term folklore coloniale, colonial folklore, to refer to the scientific domain to which these studies belonged, and urging scholars of folk traditions to collect the sayings, as he put it, on the lips of the populations of our first colony. From 1921, he taught African ethnography at the Oriental Institute of the University of Naples. He published a number of general studies on Africa, mainly Italian East Africa, as well as specific ones on ritual, on childhood customs, and on juridical folklore in Italy. Irish folklore studies, as developed from the last decade of the 19th century, strongly shaped by cultural nationalism, and like the field in other countries, was closely related to philology, specifically with the language revival movement, the Gaelic League. The key figure was Douglas Hyde, a literary scholar, poet, dramatist, and translator, co-founder and first president of the Gaelic League, a pioneering folklorist, first professor of modern Irish at University College Dublin, and first president of Ireland. A gifted linguist, he was aware of philological influence on folklore studies and of current anthropological research. He spent the 1890-1891 academic year teaching at the University of New Brunswick in Canada. This is him in his forest when he was living in New Brunswick. A hunting expedition brought him into contact with the Maliseet, an Algonquian-speaking First Nations people, the local indigenous community. Evenings by the campfire in the forest allowed him to record stories from a bilingual Maliseet. Referring to the Maliseet tales he heard, he wrote that, quote, "the genuine Indian stories were like the stories of every primitive race," end of quote. The supernatural tales he found resembled those he had recorded from Irish peasants. He wrote with some sympathy of the Maliseet and compared their maintenance of their native language favourably to Irish speakers in Hyde's native convent. To what extent he was influenced by his short Maliseet adventure is hard to say, although there are echoes of it in his influential manifesto, The Necessity for De-Anglicising Ireland, which published in 1892, and in which he referred to Irish place names corrupted through Anglicisation, and this is what he wrote about Irish place names, Anglicised. They have been treated with about the same respect as if they were the names of a savage tribe which had never before been reduced to writing, and with about the same intelligence and contempt as vulgar English squatters treat the topographical nomenclature of the Red Indians, end of quote. I'm nearly finished. Writing about what he calls colonial legacies in Europe, the French anthropologist Benoit de l'Etoile notes that it is assumed that this only concerns those, as he puts it, who live in countries that once had a colonial empire, such as Britain, Portugal, Spain, the Netherlands, or France, but that it had little to do with, for example, the Swiss, the Slovenes, the Finns, or the Greeks, since they were victims of other continental empires. He points out, however, that if colonial projects were to a large extent organised as national enterprises, personnel were recruited more widely, and he mentions Danish slave ship captains, Swiss military officers, Swedish missionaries, German mining engineers, Hungarian explorers, or Polish anthropologists in the service of the various colonial powers. He argues that there is a strong case to be made that Europe as a whole has been shaped, both objectively and subjectively, by its colonial experience, and that, I quote, that the colonial setting was one of the contexts where being European acquired its meaning, end of quote. European folkloristics developed as a kind of domestic ethnography, but as a part of a general ethnography, it was informed by wider global processes. The ideas that informed the field were shaped by colonial encounters in the Americas, in Siberia, in India. The valorization of oral tradition around which the field of folkloristics grew was, as we have seen, strongly influenced by the American context. Lafitaux's observations of the history of the Iroquois being preserved in oral traditions was echoed more than a century later by readers of the epic Kalevala, published in a language that had no significant literary traditions until then. Having read it, the chair of Finland's preeminent scholarly body, the Finnish Literature Society, was able to declaim that Finland now had a history. In 1851, Castrén, whom I referred to previously, in his inaugural lecture as first professor of Finnish language and literature at the University of Helsinki, spoke of ethnology as a science which deals with the religion, social conditions, customs and traditions of nations, and that it could be considered, quote, as a part of cultural history, but not all nations have a history in the highest sense of the word. It is this very study, ethnology, which constitutes their history, end of quote. Writing at the time of the 1848 revolutions, Marx and Engels, echoing Hegel, had termed those European peoples who had been unable to build a state, peoples without history. This statist perspective has long influenced the writing of national histories. Living in a world of empires from which they sometimes benefited, and informed in good part by the intellectual and scientific results of colonial encounters, the early European folklorists worked in an incipient research field. The early European folklorists working in an incipient research field nevertheless found a way of writing against the grain of empire, if I can put it in such a way, and demonstrated that there was no such thing as a people without history. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dermot. We have some time for some questions before the reception.
I got one.
Okay, Marge?
So, what about early-ish American ethnographers and influence that they might have had among European folklorists? I'm thinking of Neihardt, Black Elk Speaks, or Mooney's Ghost Dance Religion.
Yeah, but of course, as you can see, I very cleverly called it European folklore studies,
Right.
so I wouldn't have to deal with this more complicated issue. But yeah, I mean, it's something that I'm still trying to make sense of that for myself.
Love to hear it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Other questions? I've got one. Now, this is not a major point of yours, but it's going to take me a minute to get to the question, but really what I'm asking you to do is maybe say more about one of your points. You mentioned that European travelers, traders, missionaries, sailors, colonial officials, they brought back non-European, non-Western artifacts, and that makes sense. But then there are certain places like Ireland, I think you mentioned Norway as well, that after independence, these collections were ignored. In Ireland, largely because they were collected by Anglo-Irish elites. And then, but after independence, the national story shifts. Like, we're not colonizers, we're the plucky underdog colonized. That's a more emotionally satisfying national story. So that's an interestingly complicated situation. My question is actually simplistic. What happened to those collections?
Yeah. They're still there, as far as I know. Well, they are still there. And I mean, I think some countries have perhaps displayed them. In Ireland, I know there have been some exhibitions where there were. But I mean, at one stage there was, I think, a plan to exhibit the non-Western collections in a new wing of the museum, but nothing has happened so far. They're there in storage by and large.
So they're largely in storage, and it may be in the future that they get brought out in public light in a more complicated register, but that movement hasn't quite happened yet?
Yeah. I think that definitely there will be an interest, all right. Yeah. I mean, one of the things you can see now is that in the last 10 or 15 years, there've been a much more nuanced interrogation of Ireland's relationship to empire and to colonialism. The book came out last year on Ireland and the slave trade. And I think other European countries as well have been asking these questions about themselves. In the Nordic countries, the notion of colonialism is sometimes used to explain the relationship between the Scandinavians and Finns and the Sami, for example. So I think it's and of course museums as well often have artifacts that show this sort of colonial connection. And of course, at times, I read something online. There was a debate about that in Estonia too, about showing some non-Western artifacts that that were acquired at one stage, and how is this used to represent the Estonian people who see themselves as a colonized people. But of course, I mean, there were Estonian doctors in the Belgian colonial administration, Congo, for example. I mean, so these are sort of complicated. These are complicated issues, but I do think that there has been a much greater sensitivity to that in many Western European countries, certainly in more recent years.
Just a quick follow-up. Did I dream this, or in the basement of the Bull Library at UCC, was there not a mummy?
That's a very, very interesting one, because actually there's an artist Cork called Dorothy Cross who lives in Connemara, actually, and so she became interested in that because she'd heard about it. And I remember at one stage there was a guy, a local eccentric who was picketing the university saying send the mummy back to Egypt. But this is many years ago. But Dorothy Cross then investigated, and she discovered that actually the mummy was up the road in Letterfrack for restoration. So she and a number of others organised basically a campaign to make contact with the museum authorities in Egypt, and they arranged for it to be sent back. And so she actually published a book now. It's just come out, in which there are a number of essays on that whole question of the repatriating the mummy. So I mean, there have been repatriations, all right, and partly, for example, to Maori, somebody can inform. Is it Tamoy, the term for the shrunken heads, which were acquired as sort of, as museum exhibits in many European countries, but a few of those ended up in Irish collections as well, and certainly there was no problem in repatriating those to New Zealand. So I think in Ireland, because in a way there is a reluctance to engage with how these artifacts arrived in Ireland in the first place, they're quite happy to help anyone who claims them. Whereas we know with the British Museum, of course, that it's very, very different. And so I think it's anyone who wants non-Western ethnographic artifacts that are in Irish collections to be repatriated. My feeling is that the government and the museum authorities would be well disposed towards that. Because I suppose these collections have never really come to the attention of the broader public. It's only the initiated who know that they exist. There was a conference some years ago in which I participated in Maynooth, actually, and a number of specialists on various aspects of those collections gave papers, and they appeared as a book, actually. So there is a book on these non-Western ethnographic collections in Irish museums.
Interesting. Dorian.
It might just be the bias of the slides with the quotes you like, but my narrow reading of this sort of matches the same. It seems like the French are doing a lot more of those comparisons than the English are. Do you have any thoughts on that? Is that just sort of a commitment to cultural evolutionism in England? Is it because they had Rousseau and the English had Hobbes? Yeah. Why are they looking so much more often to kind of compare themselves to their, or maybe it's the colonial states and the way they were run that they seem to be making these connections a lot more than the Brits ever are.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question, and I can't say that I'd be particularly well qualified to answer it, but I mean, I go to France a lot, and I suppose I've tried to read up a lot on, you know, the sort of museum questions, particularly questions of non-Western collections in France. And of course, you know, the most famous museum in that sense is the Musée du Quai Branly, which is the non-Western art museum right next to the Eiffel Tower in Paris. And it's and there's been a lot of criticism about that, because the argument has been made, of course, that by converting these collections into the collections of an art museum, you evade sort of the question of the colonial question, basically, because previously these were displayed in the, you know, there was the Musée d'Afrique et d'Océanie, the Museum of African and Oceanian Art. They were in the Musée de l'Homme as well. Whereas, so the Musée de l'Homme now is simply a museum of, you know, of sort of Homo sapiens rather than anything else. And but the Musée du Quai Branly as well, it acquires material now in the art market, rather than, you know, in the way that anthropological collections were previously acquired by teams of researchers or by or whatever. So but I mean, I've been to there a number of times, and I have to say I do like it, but I accept the argument too, like that in a way it sort of sidelines this question. So I mean, I'm not sure really. I know, like, that, you know, that Macron set up a commission to investigate you know, the non-Western collections in French museums, and I think that by and large they showed a willingness, at least, to engage with some of these debates. But I mean, I suppose there was a time I read a lot more about that, and I'm not necessarily au fait with where it is today. But I mean, certainly, I think the sort of regional museums in Britain, there's been no problem. But I think the British Museum and I think the state collections, as far as I know, that they're governed by law. I think these collections can't be. They can't. Nothing can be de-accessioned, if you like. So that, but of course we know laws can be changed if necessary. And this has been the argument against repatriating, for example, the Parthenon marbles.
A couple more questions. Ben.
As a PhD student with one foot in the folklore department and one foot in a department that used to be called the Uralic and Altaic Studies department, I really appreciate your inclusion of the Russian colonization aspect of the, you know, developments of ethnology and folklore studies. And I also, you caught my attention with noticing the differences between the gradual overland colonization processes in the Russian Empire. And I was wondering, in your estimation of these various intellectual trends, was it only with the sort of contact with ideas that were developing in, say, Germany, that Russians began to approach the study of Uralic and Altaic and Paleo-Siberian, etc., peoples in their own empire with these same attitudes that emerged from overseas colonization? Or do you think that the, I guess, circumstances were similar enough that it was a natural thing? I guess I'm saying, was it these German-Russian ethnographers doing the work that allowed for those ideas to be applied in the, like, Russian overland empire?
Yeah, I mean, thanks for that question. I mean, it's, you know, certainly I'd refer you to the Wöhlen book, which is where, you know, I've learned most. I mean, I've read a few other things as well, but certainly from what he says, that, you know, the German scholars were to the fore in establishing this sort of research field in the Russian Empire, and you know, I'm not sure. And of course, you know, I mean, Franz Boas was a product of a German intellectual culture as well. So there's a sense, of course, in which they're not, you know, they're not necessarily from completely different worlds. But certainly, I think that, you know, the history of disciplines has been somewhat different there, and even and of course, one of the things that, you know, even just writing a book now, I mean, even the terms, they mean different things at different times. You know, that I mean, you know, anthropology, you know, at one stage it was a sort of a philosophical, you know, meditation, and then later on it becomes part of natural history, where, so, and, you know, much of the 19th century in France, anthropology was basically physical anthropology, which, you know, was completely compromised by racism. So, and then of course you find that, I mean, in France, that cultural anthropology, the term ethnology came to be the normal term for it. And I think it's really only with Levi-Strauss that they started using anthropology again. But I think that one of the reasons why ethnology came to be used for the cultural anthropology was that anthropology was sort of tied up so much with physical anthropology, and there was a sort of a fight between them and different institutions as well over this field. And Van Gennep was very much involved with all of these as well. So it's a very, I mean, there's quite a lot has been written about that actually, and yeah, I mean, it's very interesting. And I mean, I know I spent a lot of time in Finland and Estonia over the years, and I know in those countries they're very well informed about their kindred peoples, if you like, in Russia, you know, the Udmurt and the Mordvins and so on. And actually, in the, I don't know if any of you have been to the Estonian National Museum, but one of the standing exhibitions is actually of the kindred peoples, the other Uralic people. So, and maybe too, because the Finns and the Estonians are, you know, they're small nations, not many people speak their languages, and they're isolated by unrelated languages. They're surrounded by unrelated languages. So for them, this sense of an affinity with, you know, belonging to a larger world is and was important. I mean, I suppose that, you know, in Finland, you know, meet a lot of people who study Hungarian, and vice versa, because they are related languages. You know, in the same way, I suppose, that you'll find in Irish universities people who study Old Irish and study Welsh, related languages. So there's that aspect to it as well. And I think too, it's always been, to some extent, a part of folklore studies as well. And I mean, tied up a bit with irredentism as well, that, you know, the people across the border speak our language, and our folklorists would like to study them. And if you look at ethnographic maps as well, like that, they often, you know, you wonder, is there a political dimension to these as well. But I mean, is it Finnish or Hungarian that you've concentrated on?
No, neither. I do Turkic.
Oh, Turkic, okay.
Yeah,
okay.
But I have plenty of colleagues that do.
Okay, fair enough, yeah. Thank you.
Bearing in mind that we have a reception to go to and conversation can continue, does anyone want to ask a final public question? Millie.
Just only one question, but I have two questions. I have two questions. One is about your book. I actually started reading, and I don't know, I apologize because I was there for 20 minutes because of this nature of this building. So the question about your book that is, so you actually argue in your book that folklore studies in Europe are globally integral from the beginning. So do you find any register within the field to acknowledging this colonial or cross-cultural dimension? If you found
Sorry, but I can't fully hear you. If you wouldn't mind just asking, is there? I can. Sorry, from the very back, I find it's. I can't fully hear you. Sorry.
I'm wrong.
No.
So the question about your book, I started reading that, but I couldn't finish yet. So I don't know if the answer is in this book. So I wrote this question. So in your book, you argue that folklore studies in Europe were globally entangled from the beginning. Did you find any resistance within the field to acknowledging the colonial or cross-cultural dimension? If you found, how do you interpret that resistance? Interdisciplinary blind spot or ideological discomfort?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things about, and if I'm answering your question, is, I find when you're doing something like that, you're very limited with what you can read for a start, with the languages you can read. and I think you're limited to what's in your, what sort of material is available to you in a library. So I find often that, I mean, even if you try and avoid it, these sort of books still privilege, they privilege voices from the centres, from Western centres, where where you can access libraries and where the Western publishers' materials are easily found. So there's that sense in which I find like that it's hard to be as aware of what's. I mean, it's easy for me to know what's going on in France or Italy, but it's more difficult for example, in India. If Indians are publishing with Oxford or whatever, then you'll find it. But otherwise, a lot of research circulates nationally, not internationally. And I mean, often it's international publishers who have national imprints, and they just decide that they're only going to circulate it within one market. So there is that attitude, all right, that there's and I think. So in that sense, I feel like that, I'm reading all the stuff that the French or the Italian ethnographers write, but I'm less informed about what's being written in, for example, in Algeria or in Eritrea today, and so I think I have to confess that. Those are the sort of limitations I feel I'm dealing with. I mean, was that the question exactly? Oh, okay, thank you.
Because before starting reading this book, I actually did some book reviews. So there are something about this, like questioning about this, and as I have this chance to ask you directly, so that's why I asked. And can I ask the next question?
Okay, one more, then we'll go to the discussion.
Thank you. So it's a very, maybe very generic or a very normal question to you. So as we are studying folklore, and like as a young folklorist, if we wanted to study the colonial roots related folklore and everything, so what would you suggest to us? How can we approach this?
I mean, I suppose certainly these sort of intellectual disciplinary histories like Diarmuid's, I find those very useful, and I suppose that, I mean, there's a huge literature on colonialism now, and of course there are new approaches all the time. So, I mean, if you in a long career like my own, that there might be there's a particular period when I read a lot about oral history, for example, but I haven't really read anything in oral history in 30 years now. So, if you ask me to suggest any titles, I'm probably suggesting titles now that are ancient, that are long outdated. So I think that's one of the issues about if you try and take a very broad approach to something, you might find that you're reading the cutting edge stuff in parts of it, but in other parts I'm sort of acutely aware in my own book that some of the stuff is probably based very much on sort of outmoded readings or outmoded research. But I mean, you do your best.
Thank you, Dermot. Thank you so much.